Hey everybody, how's it going? Corey here from Themeco with a grid layout breakdown for you all. So I've got this Mosaic section I've been working on, and I thought it'd be cool to walk you all through not just the general configurations I'm using to get everything fitting together just so, but also some considerations to keep in mind, such as how would you fit these squares across a grid and mix that in with this text, which will of course wrap and respond differently across our breakpoints. In addition to that, I've got a cool little CSS Easter Egg, which I think really takes this design to a whole new level. So lots of fun stuff, and let's just dive right in. Now, one of the first things I do when working through any grid-based layout is really think through the general functionality and feel of the layout itself, and I try and get my canvas, if you will, laid down before I do anything else, and I'll try and do that across all my breakpoints. Now, the reason why I do that is because we have these awesome tools in the grid, such as the cell layout editor, which allow you to not only visualize your cells, but drag them around, resize them, and experiment with layouts very quickly. However, to do that, we've got to first have our actual canvas, our template in place to do that on. So one of the first things I'll do is I'll think through, how do I want this to look and respond? I'll get that in place, and then I will start one by one adding my elements and playing around with their positioning. So as far as the actual template is concerned for this layout, we've got a zero gap grid here, and that is so that all of our squares and elements can be kind of positioned right up next to each other. And then we've got all of our cells stretching both horizontally and vertically just to give us these squares. Now, to get these squares set up, there's actually a little bit of a trick we have to do to get it working. As far as the columns template goes across all of my breakpoints, I'm effectively using our repeat statement, which again takes two parameters. The first one here says, how many times should I repeat this second value here? So we want to repeat this one FR value 8 times on our large breakpoint here. And we can see that if we count across our tracks here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that is giving us our columns template, and we're effectively doing that on each breakpoint, just changing this value here. We go down to 6 for medium and small, and then 4 for our extra small breakpoint. But then to get these actual square row tracks for us to work with and position our cells in, we've got to do a little bit of CSS calc magic. So how that effectively works is, again, we've got our repeat statement. We're just repeating this second value 4 times over for this particular breakpoint. And in here, we've got calc 100 VW. So again, a VW unit is basically a percentage of the viewport. So this is saying 100% of the viewport, and then divide that value by 8. Now, the reason why we're dividing it by 8 is because 8 is the column count we're using for our 1FR columns here. So I always like to try and help visualize these things when I can. Let's actually measure one of our columns here and just see about how wide it is. It's about 139, 140 pixels wide. Now let's take our actual screen width. So if we measure that, it's about 1100 pixels of this particular viewport that I'm looking at. So let's take 1100 pixels and divide it by 8, which gives us roughly 138, 140 pixels, which is the width of our squares here when we're using a 1FR unit to just have it fill space equally. So effectively, the trick to get these tracks that have the matching width and height is, how many tracks do you need, or how many rows rather, use that for the repeat statement, and then take your 100 VW here and then divide it by the number of columns you're using here. And you'll see that we're using that exact same pattern here, 100 VW divided by 8. But then here, we're going down to 100 VW divided by 6, because right here, we have 6 columns going across. For our small viewport, we've got the same, 100 VW divided by 6. And then for our final one here, we've got 100 VW divided by 4 because we have 4 columns. This right here is effectively what gives us these perfect square tracks for us to position our elements into. Now, where things get a little tricky is thinking through how we will work with elements like this text. All of these squares are kind of designed to be self-contained. They kind of sit within the square itself. I might have a little bit of text vertically centered like this, or maybe positioned in a bottom corner, but everything within that square is very small, and there's not a lot of characters that will wrap eventually as the content gets too long. So with this text here, we've got to be a little careful. Now, on my large and extra large breakpoints, all I'm really doing is taking that cell and positioning it into these tracks. So if you had some text in here that was too long, it might start wrapping and actually breaking down below here. So this is an important consideration when working with this particular layout. The amount of text I actually put into this box is something I've got to think of. I can't have it be too long, or it might start wrapping into this square. And that's just because of the general layout on these large and extra large breakpoints. I've got it kind of positioned inside the grid here. Now what I did on my medium, small, and extra small breakpoints is I effectively put the text still in line horizontally with the grid, but I kind of placed it on its own track above everything else. And that gave me a space down below here that I could put everything on these square tracks, but then have the text wrap or be as long or as short as it needs to be for each particular breakpoint. Now the way we do that, if I go over to my rows template here, you'll see that my first row for all of these breakpoints from medium down to extra small is auto. And this auto value allows this first row to effectively grow or shrink in height as it needs to. So notice as I size this down just a little bit more here, you'll see right there the text wraps from 4 lines to 5 lines. And without that auto value, if I used a fixed value, for example, that text would start to move down into these squares. But since I'm using auto, it's allowing it to grow as it needs to. Same thing here. You'll see if I go down to my small breakpoint, again, it's still horizontally aligning with the grid, but my first value here, auto, allows it to grow as it needs. And then finally on extra small, it just spans the entire width and is still auto, so we can grow. So that was one of the trickier aspects of this design and kind of figuring it out. But ultimately, I kind of realized the pattern worked like that. This is kind of my primary call to action text or introduction text that I really want people to see. So I knew I really wanted the visibility to be high on smaller screens. But then when I had more space on my large and extra large breakpoint, for example, I knew that because of the line lengths and the text I was using here, I could position it inside the grid and it would be fine. Beyond that, it was really a matter of discovering sort of the patterns I wanted to use on these other square sections of the grid. And I ultimately came up with these kind of dark stat sections, if you will. And I actually labeled them statistic here, which you can see in our list. I've also got these more prominent kind of client tiles where I used a background image and a logo as well as a name. And then just to help fill in space and kind of give a little bit of a designed feel, I've got these blank tiles here, which are effectively just empty gray tiles. I've got a gap in here just to get rid of that empty state feel, but they're really just filling in space. And the cool thing about those is as I respond things down and move these where I want, I can then just fill in the space as I need to with these gray tiles to kind of tie it all together. Additionally, on some breakpoints, such as my small breakpoint, I actually went a little bit wider with these statistics, again, just to fill things in and play around with the design some. So just because we're using this square pattern doesn't mean we can't break out of it from time to time and do something a little bit different. You'll also see that on this particular breakpoint, my client squares here are actually rectangles as well. I just brought them out to be a little bit wider. It just filled in this breakpoint a little bit better. Now, as for creating these cells and kind of finding the patterns I wanted to use and placing them in, something that I think helps to make it a little bit easier when working on these complex setups is, again, start with your main piece, kind of what's the focal point, which for me is this text. And then what's kind of the next most important piece and work your way back from there. So I started next with these client tiles and ultimately just came up with the look and feel for them. Basically a background image with a little bit of a gradient, logo in the middle, and the client name down here. And since those are bigger, I wanted to work with them first and really find their positioning on each breakpoint. And then from there, we came up with the statistic tiles, and I can place those where I need them to go. And then we end up with these filler blank tiles, which really just come in behind everything else and kind of tie it together. So start by positioning your main elements, figuring out where they need to go, just experiment stuff. That's effectively what I did. I'll come to each breakpoint, turn on the cell layout editor, and try dragging things around. So I might try moving this out, seeing if I like it, moving it back, and really just playing around with lots of different ideas. And that exploration is really a fun part of the process. For example, at one point, I think I was even toying around with the idea of layering some of these images and just seeing how that looked. And the cool thing with that layout editor is we can do that really quick. Just move them over, see if you like it. Ultimately, I opted to not go with that look, and it's as easy as moving things back to where they were before, and you're good to go. Now, as for each of these tiles themselves, starting with the client tiles, what I'm doing with them is I've got the Flexbox layout turned on, and that's allowing me to position this headline towards the end of the tile. You can see here that we're also stretching things out horizontally. As for the actual image and the client logo, those are both being set using the advanced background here. So I've got my lower layer set up with the image, and then my upper layer is set up with the logo for each one. Now, a trick that I'm using here is how I'm setting up the size and position of each logo. The logo that I've got right here is for my little coffee shop over here. And what I've done is position it dead center inside that cell, but I'm setting up its size using the width. So you can see that I can bump this value up and down, and that will change the overall size of the logo. And I can find just what width works best for me, and then set the height to be auto. The logo will responsively size based on the size of the cell. So you'll notice if I bring this down here, and my cell here has grown a little bit, this logo got just a little bit bigger to fill in that space. Similarly with this cell, I'm doing kind of the same thing, but I'm doing it by height because this one was a little bit taller and I didn't want it to interfere with this text. So I'm basically saying this logo should never be taller than 40% of the cell's height, and that should always keep it out of the way of the title down here. And again, you'll see if I size it down, the logo is a little bit bigger, but not coming into my text here. And of course, I can simply play with those values and just find the one that works best for me and what I'm trying to accomplish. So after I had those set up, effectively what I did with these statistics here is I've got a headline, and it's using 1M as its base font size. And then for the main text line here, I've just bumped it up a little bit. And then for the subheadline, it's just set up to 1M. Now, I am using some custom CSS to effectively tweak the font sizes as we go up and down to different breakpoints. Let me actually find the correct element here. And you'll see that really all I'm doing is on different breakpoints, moving the font size of certain elements up and down. And that just gives me a little more control over how this text looks. Another way I could do it would simply be to set up my base font sizing and my theme options to what I want it to be on the site. And I could set these up using rem units, and they would size up and down. But for this particular example, I just wanted to try it out with this kind of pixel approach. So all I'm really doing here is just tweaking these values as I saw fit, as felt best to me, as I size the screen up and down. In addition to that, for some of these cells, such as my text here, it starts off with a little bit of side padding, just to bump it away from the edge here, and some bottom padding. See that spacing here. However, when I size my screen up, I want that side padding, for example, to go away. So at certain breakpoints, I would remove that or tweak it as needed, again, just to get things positioned just right. Now, as for my fun little CSS Easter egg that I think would be fun to walk through, I'm going to add this class here, has lines. And if you notice over here, very subtly in the background, you see these vertical lines matching the overall structure of my grid. So that is done with a bit of custom CSS. Now, it might look a little intimidating, but I think what you'll see with all these calc statements and how they're set up is they're actually pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of breaking down kind of what's going on, and you'll see how it correlates to the overall setup. So basically what I'm doing is when I add that has lines class to my grid, it's going to make overflow hidden on the parent. And that's just important so that these lines don't extend beyond the section and interfere with my design as a whole. Next, what I did is I set up a pseudo-element, which if you're not familiar with these are basically just little elements that we can add to our designs so that we don't have to add unnecessary markup to our pages. So this before element is a fake element we can place before all of our content and do whatever we need to do with it. And in this case, I'm positioning it absolutely to my section, and you'll see that it's placed at the top and bottom of the section, so it's spanning the entire height. But then it's offset to the left by -1 pixel, which also happens to be the width of the element that I'm placing. So basically just think of a long vertical line 1 pixel wide, which is what you're seeing here. Then I've just set up the color to be this very light gray, and then I'm setting my background color to the current color. So it's using this value here. Pointer events none is just a trick we can use in CSS to make sure that this element won't interfere with any of our clicking over here. So if we had a button, we can just make sure this is completely out of the way and not going to mess up any of that. And then this is where the fun part starts. So starting with my large breakpoint here, you'll notice that these calculations look a little similar to how we set up the row heights themselves. So we're taking our 100 VW value, dividing it by the number of columns that are in our layout, and then just multiplying it by that number as well. So for my first value, 1, second value is 2. Then we're adding a 1 pixel offset to bump it back over to the right. And effectively what this is doing is these multiple box shadow values are creating duplicates of our one line that is hidden off to the side of the screen here. So remember, we've got that pseudo element positioned off to the side of the screen here. And then we're using our general template value here to just sort of create these mirrored lines all the way across the screen. Now, one thing I experimented with first was placing pseudo elements inside the cells and having them span the whole height of the section. But there were some issues with that because sometimes these lines might appear over certain content. We didn't want that to happen. And there was also situations like this one here, where I've got this 2x2 client cell, and there's no cell right here where maybe I can make a line underneath this text and in the middle of this cell. Ultimately, I opted for this technique, and I think it worked really well. And the only thing you would need to do if you ever did happen to change this layout would be go back to each breakpoint here and simply adjust these values to match the column count that you're using for that breakpoint. The one final thing we did here was, of course, set our Z index pretty low just to push it below everything. But the really cool thing about that, you can see as I responded down, is we've got these lines matching the overall layout of our mosaic at each breakpoint. So just a fun little detail that I think adds just a little bit of texture and really just kind of takes it over the top. One thing to keep in mind with this line custom CSS is it will not work if you have a container on this, because these lines are based on the viewport positioning. So if you've got a global container on, constraining all this to be smaller than the full width of the screen, then this will not work. But of course we can simply take that off, and we've got our basic mosaic, which we could jump back to here, turn a container on if we want, and tweak our values just to get our squares working the way we need them to. So there you have it. That is basically the breakdown of our mosaic layout. I hope you guys picked up a couple useful tricks there, maybe some things you can take into your next build. And we look forward to seeing what you do with all that knowledge moving forward.